challenge that Damon Defense provided services for, it's hardware resources to in Berlin as well. It's basically a one-day event we did last year. I'd probably, Ian would be better at explaining a lot of these topics, but essentially we had one day event where we had 10 teams of 7 students who came from all different high schools across the province. And essentially we built a number of targets for them that were identical environments. At the beginning of the day, we rated all of the virtual machines for their relative security score for how virtual machines perform. Then we gave the students most of a day to secure and harden those machines, to discover challenges, to discover and secure their machines, and to basically pursue, and more importantly, to really learn about cybersecurity. And ultimately, all of that was built around, all of that caused the requirement for all of this compute, memory, disk capacity requirements for many different virtual machines. And ultimately, we had no budget together for it. We looked at a number of different possible solutions for meeting those requirements. Putting together dozens of virtual machines is not a light task. It's not something you spin up on your mother's laptop. So we looked at a couple different solutions. Is anybody here familiar with Cyber Patriot in the United States? Yeah, okay. Cyber Patriot is basically a competition that's somewhat similar in the students' experience, but the students aren't actually logging into virtual machines. They are essentially driving simulators. It's almost like having like a flash experience that looks like you're logging into a machine, but there's no actual machine behind it. So anyway, we looked at a simulator type solution like that. It had some pros and cons. The largest con we found was licensing and setup time, and realistically, it's just not a good experience for the students. If you're looking at a simulator experience, you can't go outside the path. If the programmer who designed the simulator does not specify that certain path for you to explore, it's not there. You can't go that direction. That also opens up, though, a lot of controls we can do. For example, preventing students from locking themselves out of a remote desktop, which occurred many different times. So we looked at this as one possible solution. We also considered doing one team at a time, staging the event in multiple successive stages where one team would come in, they'd have their time at the competition, we'd score them and move on. This basically ultimately couldn't work due to timeline constraints. If we have to do a one-day event, we can't realistically have 10 different students going through in that amount of time, 10 different teams of students, going through that amount of time. We looked at building and hosting the infrastructure ourselves. We looked at the kind of architecture that we could realistically put together with the resources available, what that would take, what that would look like, whether we could use virtualization platforms if we need dedicated hardware for all of the different systems involved. And finally, we looked at, again, build it ourselves, but host it on the cloud, on off-premise systems. So those systems are like Amazon or whatever. Ultimately, same basic structure, but hosting it in somebody else's hardware. So ultimately, we picked up that we're going to build it ourselves. We hosted it on-premise in our own data centers. Specifically, Damon Defense has some data center space in the Smart Park. Merlin has tons of resources from a network and routing capacity with their connections to tons of different network resources. We chose ESXi as our platform to do the initial build. And we'll talk more about that in some of our later slides about the use of ESXi. But for the initial build that we did with ESXi, our licensing ultimately ended up being free. We got 60-day trials of everything. We built all of the virtual machines very quickly, tore it down. Licensing legality on some of the virtual machines is questionable, but I'm going to henceforth ignore that for the rest of the presentation. We found that it was relatively resilient, of course. Anybody here VMware administrators? Anybody run like clusters of machines? Similarly, Hyper-V or any other virtual machine clustering? Okay. So anyway, so I guess you're probably somewhat familiar with that, but ultimately we can run tons of virtual machines and move them around across our hardware and have a resilient experience for our students where if one of the blades blows up, we don't find ourselves in a situation where we're immediately out of compute capacity and find ourselves running the blades that just have stopped working. Anyway, it was important for us to have a resilient solution, fast VM cloning as well. We'll talk again about our VM cloning in a couple later slides, but if you're familiar with virtual machine technology, we can literally build targets and then clone them a whole bunch of times. And also an existing knowledge base. The staff and volunteers mostly, almost exclusively. Do we have any? We didn't have anybody getting paid. No, so nobody got paid for any of this, but that's going to change.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Anyway, so with our our volunteer-based workforce, we had to work with the existing knowledge-based attorney that we have, which is VMware's.
Okay. What we end up with for this event is we effectively have to build two networks. We have a network called a game site network, so that's where all the students are. And then somewhere else we have it's Merlin and Spencer, the Smart Park, we have the server networks. So the game site network is kind of interesting. We didn't know necessarily where the games were going to happen. So what we had to do is we had to design for this thing to be essentially dropped into anywhere. I think the original plan was to be at the Louis Riel Arts and Technology Center. But it could have happened at a convention center, it could have happened, anywhere. So we need to be able to drop it into any environment and essentially like bring our own kind of network. But of course, so we're, a bunch of security professionals, some people might have called us hackers, whatever. We need complete and absolute isolation from our host networks. So we can imagine the conversation you'd have to say like, yeah, I want to drop a network on top of yours, and we're going to be a bunch of hackers, and it's going to be great, can you let us in? So that's kind of an awkward conversation. We had to have a high speed and low latency, ideally, link back to Merlin. So again, the original idea is to be able to drop this like somewhere on the internet. It's going to call home, and we'll be able to interface with the servers or the target network, I guess it is. One of the important things is that because there might have been stuff like Nmap running, we don't want any security devices between the game network and the server network to muck with our traffic. Nmap is a really important thing that we're going to use here, right? I don't want an IPS messing with our traffic. So we had to guarantee the integrity of that traffic. If you've done some CISSP stuff, you know that there's three tenets of IT security. You have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Well, confidentiality doesn't really matter too much on this. I don't care if people read the traffic, but the integrity and the availability of that interconnect is super important. Yeah, we need to IPS. Okay. And also, there was a bit of a variable here in that all the students brought their own equipment. Again, we're doing this on no budget, right? So the students either had their own equipment or they were using equipment provided by their respective high schools. So we really didn't know what kind of disaster they were going to bring. We have to expect they're going to bring malware onto the network, frankly. And just to cover our butts, we did a packet capture of all traffic that left the game site network onto down the tunnel. We didn't end up having to do any forensic analysis post game, but we actually recorded everything. And it's an interesting data set anyway. So we ended up doing this at the Red River College Princess Street campus, and I guess I don't really know how it played out, but. I think their academic folks said, yes, you can host your event here, and it's going to be great. But then their IT security team got hold of what's going to happen, and they kind of want, you want to bring what onto our network? And so we had some very awkward conversations, like, are you guys going to be using hacker tools like Nmap or whatever? Are there going to be viruses? I had to say, well, yeah, probably. The student laptops and stuff. Yeah, it's going to be probably kind of nasty. An interesting question was whether or not we needed Wi-Fi access, and our answer to that was that we actually don't want to do this under Wi-Fi because the college has, I'm sure, spent a load of money doing site surveys and making sure that their wireless is really tight, and I didn't want to mess with that. So we decided that none of this was going to be Wi-Fi, everything was going to be hardwired, so that we could kind of prove to them that we have control over all the traffic. We don't touch your Wi-Fi. Don't even use the cloud. And they really wanted to know what assurances we could give them that it's not going to harm their network. Essentially, we just gave them everything we had. We gave them our network topology diagrams. We gave them everything. Router configs. They had everything. So they were able to take that to their IT security staff and really evaluate what we were doing in a very open and friendly kind of manner. Which I think, that certainly didn't hurt the relationship that we had with Red River, and they ended up being, spectacular hosts. Okay, now on the server side, from the network perspective, it was hosted at Damon Defense. Actually, all the servers ended up being at Damon Defense, Chris's shop. But again, this is across the city with Merlin at the U of M and Smart Card. At Merlin, so I won't get into too much about what Merlin does, but we provide internet transit to a lot of the school divisions and almost all the post-secondaries in the province. So we have a 4 gigabit pipe to the internet, and we have an Akamai cache. Most of you probably aren't familiar with Akamai, but Akamai is a content distribution network, if you will. And they do stuff like they host Microsoft updates and Adobe updates and antivirus software updates and a whole bunch of different content. The reason that's important, of course, is that these students are, their job is to secure these servers that they're given, many of which are Microsoft. And so you can imagine that, if you have to pull down I don't know how big an update, I'm not Microsoft, but how big an update is for, a Windows server, it's going to take some time. So the cool thing is that the Akamai cache on the Merlin network can actually keep those pipes full. Like, the downloads were crazy fast, and because nobody wants to sit around waiting for Microsoft updates, that totally sucks. Also, we have an access to the Canary network. I'll get into this a bit later, but essentially we have direct access. We don't go over the internet to get to Google, to Microsoft, Adobe, a whole bunch of other content providers. So we get to skip over the sometimes slow internet and go directly to content delivery networks. We had one shortcoming though, however. So Chris mentioned that Merlin and Damon Defense are in the same building, which is awesome. And we have in-building fiber, which is great. The problem is we just couldn't scrounge enough gear to actually light this thing up 10 gigabits between us, because that would have been great. But we'll do something about that next year. Maybe. Okay, so I'll set the stage. We have 10 teams of students. Animation is awesome. And we have a whole bunch of targets for every team. So the targets are a whole bunch of different operating systems. The students have to secure these things. They need to do, there's some capture the flag type of stuff that they had to do, all sorts of puzzles. And you can imagine when you're dealing with high school students that there's a huge diversity of skill sets. So we need to make sure that the folks who may have had a more basic skill set had stuff that they can do, that they can accomplish, but also some of the more, capable students could, do some crypto, right? Like to keep everybody busy. And so we had a really broad set of targets in terms of operating systems and challenges, which was really awesome. And I'll just point out that the Skullspace community really did an awesome job because we got all the skills to do that in the Skullspace community. Okay, 7 targets per team. So now we're just cloning like crazy. We've got tons of virtual machines, and you can kind of see how the requirement on the server and storage side really ramps up. So we need to glue these two things together. We used Cisco routers as loaned to us from MTS Allstream. Thank you, MTS, because I didn't have Yes, you, sir, thank you. You helped me out quite a bit, actually. So yeah, we had 2, they were 2951s, were they? Yeah. Yeah, awesome. Because I just don't have that kind of kit lying around. And so that was great. So we had a VPN tunnel between the two. We used IPsec, and again, that fulfills our requirement, like I mentioned earlier, about we need to guarantee integrity and availability. So the integrity that the IPsec gives us, right? We know if stuff's changed in transit, which is super awesome. Now, because we were at Red River College, we didn't end up going over the raw internet, which was, made me feel really good, because sometimes the internet can be quite sucky. We went over to MRNet, which is the Manitoba Research Network. We're going to come back to that in a second. But then we had all these services. We have direct peering with Microsoft, Google, Akamai, etc. 4 gig pipe to the internet at Merlin side, and none of that stuff had to go over the internet from the game side. which was pretty awesome. Okay, I'm just going to take an aside here and talk about MRNet. Manitoba Research Network is a network that not a lot of people know about, but I'm sure if any of you are in the research and education community, you use it all the time. Well, every educational institution in the province is a member, as well as the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, Data and Defense, and there's some other industry partners there as well. MRNet is the regional member of a Canary network in Manitoba. Every other province in the country has another regional network as well, as with BCnet in British Columbia, Siberia in Alberta, SRNet Saskatchewan, and other large networks. So all this to say that when we look in the future of expanding the cyber defense challenge, is that we can leverage these high-speed research and education networks to have let's say one big event where we have teams from multiple places in the country all coming over Canary on the respective optical regional networks, coming over, again, very high-speed, very reliable links. So we're really in a great position in Manitoba that we have such awesome networks. And again, nobody knows about it. MRNet, one of the things that they don't do well is publishing, actually getting the word out about what an awesome network they run. So I'm just putting a plug in there. So one of the cool things is, like, if you were on MRNet, if you did a trace route, for example, to CERN in Switzerland, none of it touches the commercial internet, which is all sorts of awesome. And you can do things. Well, the network will be advanced enough even that you could have a wavelength network provision for the cyber defense challenge, for example, across Canada, so we could actually get a wavelength theoretically, which is pretty awesome. Okay, end plug. All right.
So ultimately, with all of the network resources that Derek just talked about, we had to match up with some competing resources. A lot of these, though, had to basically come out of thin air. This equipment here is essentially, I guess, my own personal training lab provided by Data and Defense. A lot of the work that I do involves essentially building network clusters of servers. So this is the equipment that I have available in, I guess, our pool of training equipment. I'll make special comment about the Dell later, but essentially the gear from the top 3/4 of the slide here is the equipment that Data and Defense essentially loaned to the Cyber Defense Challenge, along with some optics that we had an extremely difficult time trying to find.
Can I shout out to Colin Standers for dropping that fiber optic cable off at my house? That was awesome. I don't know where he is, but anyway, he had his ground.
We threw like $150,000 in hardware at this, and we couldn't buy like $90 optics. So it was really aggravating. So ultimately, what we're looking at here is an HPC 7000. It's a rack mount enclosure. It's about 10U. And basically, each one of these can hold 16 different blades or 32 double density, or whatever the size you're using. So here pictured, we basically got 5 blades. Each of those have 2 quad-core Xeons at 2.3 gigahertz, 16 gigs of RAM, 2 300 gig 15K SAS drives, and dual 10 gig networking. And then, so all that basically totaled to 80 gigs of RAM and 234 gigahertz raw compute capacity for our hypervisor cluster. Then this Dell was actually given to us by Dell. We got huge sponsorship by Dell, and quite frankly, we really could not have done this without this server. Data and Defense and Merlin can throw huge compute and network resources at things, but we don't have any kind of disk capacity available. It's just not something to deal in. And Dell threw this server together for us, and anyway, it outperformed the 144 virtual machines that we had running on it in terms of network I/O. And if anybody is running VMware Hyper-V clusters, you have a sense of getting 144 virtual machines to run on one machine is not normal. So. It worked pretty well, actually. We ended up using all 8 of the 1 gig network cards down here. iSCSI with MKO up to the 10 gig networking in this box. That worked great. The only problem, like we said, was we could not get our 10 gig networking from this enclosure over to Merlin, the other end of the building. So all that we'll improve that for our next event, but we'll cover that. Does anybody have any questions on the hardware, or anybody have any questions up to this point? on anything we've built or the event or.
You keep on commenting like the 10 gig, you only have 1 gig connection.
Yes.
Was that actually a drawback? That like was that an actual issue that you encountered during the event?
We pretty much saturated 1 gig to the servers.
Yeah. You know, the network track is really, really bursty because, you know, we get all the students together and say, okay, your next challenge is to do, you know, whatever. And they all sit down at their computers and they're like, oh. So, you know, if you look at, when we looked at the network traffic usage, you know, it was like, okay, nothing's happening. Holy crap, we are pushing, you know, as much as we possibly can right now. So while it was it wasn't a big deal, we certainly saturated that 1 gig occasionally. And so when we look at scaling this thing out, and we'll get to that in a second, we know for sure that we can't have any 1 gig bottlenecks anywhere because that's a problem.
Any others? Sorry? Yep.
Was this dual stack?
Pardon me?
Was this dual stack?
Was this dual stack? I'll shelter you from this answer because Jared is not allowed to answer that no, this was not dual stack. We did only run IPv4 for this event. That will change in the future. Time constraints of building, yada yada yada. We didn't actually run dual stack. But I'm working on some projects that are full dual stack, so if you're curious, I can talk about those.
The reason actually it wasn't dual stack IPv4 and IPv6 is actually because when we consulted with the folks that are actually teaching the students, you know, the networking underneath this, that they are not officially being taught IPv6, which, you know, kind of makes me cry about. But I understand that that's going forward, that's not going to be the case. So yeah, we'll talk about V6 in a second, but I really want to make this thing totally dual stack. All right.
And incidentally, my laptop has a sticker on it that endorses the use of IPv6. I don't know if that's my laptop suddenly complaining. So ultimately, we started the event. Everything was operating excellently. We had a set of test events that occurred prior to the actual event. We staged it exactly the way we were going to run it for the full event. I think we changed a little bit of networking speeds because our trial event was only at a smaller venue, but everything else was exactly the same. Everything tested fairly well. We had some bugs we discovered, but stomped them out. So what could go wrong? And sorry for the turtle flash.
PowerPoint animation awesomeness.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we had Okay, so we had as one of our targets in the group of targets that all of our students had, we had one silent sleeping machine that basically, when we went into phase 3 of our competition, it woke up, which was a Windows 98 server, voicemail server, and it basically had an attack malware on it. It's called sudnuns.exe. Basically, sudnuns.exe was programmed by Nathan, sorry, yes. I don't know if Nathan's here. No? Okay. But I don't feel bad for causing that. So anyway, so Nathan programmed Sudnuns. It worked amazingly. It worked far too well, actually. Our TCP storm, do you want to talk about the router stats?
Sure. So our routers were awesome, and whoever programmed them, you know, tried to put control plane policing on them. Control plane policing is essentially like, you know, traffic goes through your router, takes a different path than traffic goes, you know, to the router's IPs itself, if you will. It's kind of simplistic, but whatever. The awesome Cisco routers that MTS lent us have hardware policing to make sure that stuff like, I don't know, a broadcast storm on a network is not going to ping the router's CPU. Whoever configured the routers kind of messed that up. And it turns out that yeah, about 17,000 packets per second were hitting the control planes of the Cisco routers. And they did not like that at all. So essentially, you know, it's just not good for networks. The routers actually stopped responding to ARP requests a little bit, and you know, so it was a problem. They weren't dead, but we certainly beat the crap out of them pretty good. They were kind of mostly dead. So all you network guys out there, network folks, control plane policing is often overlooked, but it is so freaking important because when you're building networks, you need to plan for the absolute worst. And Nathan and Ian did a great job to make the absolute worst happen. And it kind of yeah, that was a stressful moment. So what do? We didn't want to can the whole suddenly nuns thing because because it's awesome. It's nuns. But so Chris just said, well, why don't you just crank the CPU down on the virtual machines? Of course, that kind of makes sense, right? So we just gave them, I guess, 100 megahertz. And they were still pumping out, well, they'd wake up every, I don't know, 5 minutes and pump out this crazy broadcast storm, but we could deal with it at 100 megahertz. Anyway, Windows 98 was never, ever meant to run on processors that fast, and holy crap, can it generate a lot of packets. So anyway, good fun. Yes. So, oh, this is you.
So as the screen so evidently foretold, we had a very successful event. We built and burned this thing inside of 2 weeks. It was actually 2 weeks and 2 days or something. So on the issue of all of our licensing trials, if anybody who's worked for Microsoft, I had it in Toronto, that is not to us. But ultimately, we burned all of this using VMware. We cloned it all very, very quickly. Some of our targets were actually not even entered into the network until the night before we started running the event. So within a night, we went from many of the targets not even physically present in the cluster to up-cloned running on multiple different machines. We had some minor hiccups, Sudnuns being one of them. So yeah, we would have really liked to have had 10 gig the whole way through, but 1 gig was enough to definitely run the event on. In terms of peak usage, I said before that our cluster was capable of about 238 gigahertz. We did actually reach 67 gigahertz of CPU usage across our cluster. We did actually use 113 gigs. That 113 gigs is more than the 80 that I said before, because the Dell server also has 32 gigs of RAM. I think that we ended up provisioning a 6th blade like the last minute. So we had, I believe total we had 128 gigs of RAM operational, which we used 113 of, and we did actually hit 1.2 gigabits from MRNet to the internet, which was about 4 gigs right now. So now our question is, we're doing this event again in February. We need volunteers. If anybody wants to volunteer, talk to Ian, please somewhere. Ian here, somebody? Other room, okay. Anyway, if you're interested in the CDC, talk to any of us, talk to Ian. So yeah, we're going to scale for next year. One of them is manpower, obviously. Other is technologically, how can we do it better?
Okay, so yeah, we had some network shortcomings. So when we talk about scaling this thing, okay, we had 10 teams and seven virtual machines per team. How do we do this thing bigger? Not just like a couple more teams, but how do we do this with 10 teams across Canada? How do we scale this thing like orders of magnitude bigger without requiring a crazy amount of people and resources? So okay, like I mentioned before, 10 gig networking was a thing, and everything is really bursty. iSCSI traffic is really bursty. The whole event is bursty again because the students go from getting some direction from the leadership to then sitting down at their machines, heads down and let's go. So everything's really bursty. So we really need to provision for the peaks, right? How intense is this thing going to get during the day? That's what we have to provision for. Now, the other thing was that, as awesome as the Cisco routers were, going forward, I don't want to have the CDC purchase a bunch of really expensive routers that are going to be idle most of the year, right? Even if we do a few events a year, like this craft's expensive. So what we are really thinking about for next time is how are we going to scale this thing on commodity hardware? How can we essentially just borrow as many pizza box servers as we can and build the network on top of that, rather than having a whole bunch of specialized stuff? Now, we're still going to have, for example, every team had a layer 2 switch on their table so that they had full isolation from each other. Like, we're still going to need switch ports, right? But do we really need big iron routing and VPN? I'm not convinced that we do. So we're going to try and build this out to use commodity hardware and see where we go from there. We're dabbling in OpenVPN and that kind of thing right now. The other thing is that, again, when we're scaling orders of magnitude bigger, the human involvement can be a problem, right? Like we have a small number of volunteers, and so we need to make sure that there's minimal touch on this thing. We need to make sure that we can template as much as we can. So okay, we have, I don't know, 10 teams sign up at the last minute. That should be no problem. We'll just, it's rubber stamp. Clunk, 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 clunk. You got 10 more teams. Life is good. We shouldn't be panicking because we don't have enough human resource. So templating is going to be really important. Automation is going to be hugely important. And another interesting thing was that the way we did it, each team actually, they had unique IP subnets. And that ended up being a problem because, again, we can clone the virtual machines all we want, but then we have to go in there and we have to adjust IP addresses, and it's a huge pain in the ass because the network guy actually has to go in there and touch it. So what we're talking about now is having, every team is going to have an identical environment, IP addressing and everything. And how do you do that? Do we do virtual routing forwarding tables? Like how do we abstract the network even more, right? And I think that using commodity products rather than expensive routers is going to facilitate that. So yeah, automation is huge, and minimal touching is huge. IPv6, somebody, Mike asked that in the back. I'm a huge IPv6 kind of guy. And one of the instructors at the Sisler Network Academy, Charles Bazilowicz, who's out there. Hey, Charles. So he's actually teaching the students and doing awesome work. And he informed me that IPv6 would be in scope for next year. IPv6, I don't know how many of you get to walk into other people's networks and see what's on the wire. I do a lot of that, again, network generator. But you fire up Wireshark and you're like, holy crap, IPv6 is everywhere, and the network admins have no idea, right? One of my favorite things to do when you're looking at pen tests is to get in via IPv4, that Moodle server that's never patched, and then pivot around on v6 because it's everywhere. It's turned on everywhere. It's awesome. So I really think that the students having knowledge of IPv6 and actually presenting challenges to them is going to be advantageous for them going out in industry because it's on the networks. Like it or not, a lot of the IT admins that I deal with are like, yeah, you know what, I'm gonna ignore it, and I'm sure it's not gonna be a problem. All right.
So along with some obvious network changes we're planning, I'm just going to throw in one more point there that we're going to essentially treat each router, each end team as another target. So we're going to, in that slide 6 or whatever, where I had all the virtual machines that are grouped up each team, we're just going to literally have another identical router that's cloned in with them, and it will have identical configuration, but it will connect to a different team directly. So for some storage improvements, we were happy with the VM performance. I drank a lot of the Microsoft Kool-Aid. I'm a big fan of Hyper-V. Some of the guys I work with dislike that, but too bad. So basically, I was happy with the VM performance of BSides. That may or may not change pending licensing. We're currently planning on scaling from 10 teams to 24 teams. Our event in February, I believe it's 24, maybe 22 for our event in February. The performance on the hypervisor platform was excellent. But from a licensing perspective, we need to start going more legitimate. We're looking at having an environment that we can keep up all the time, rather than turn and burn it for every event, which is awesome for one event from a licensing perspective, but from human resources and actually having the time to build all this stuff kind of sucks. I don't really enjoy destroying all the work I did last week. So, anyway, we're planning on making huge use of Hyper-V 2012 R2, and also that's going to utilize SMB3. So that Dell server, if we go back down over to here, if I can get all the way back here. Sorry. So this Dell server down here, I'll come back to Falcon Store in a second. But this Dell server down here, we basically want to put Windows Server 2012 standard on it, use storage spaces, and take these 2 SSDs and go to 6, and take these 4 900 gig 10K drives and go to 8. And if any of you are familiar with storage spaces, basically that's going to enable me to use one storage platform on one server, which probably actually become 2, to host all of this storage in a way that is storage tiered, which means I'll have one logical volume, it'll be shared out as one logical SMB share, but all of that I/O will be balanced across all the SSDs and all of the rotary disks. So basically having that on top of there will allow us to go from a typical rotary disk, you're going to see maybe 100, 250 I/O. Typical SSD, you might see 50,000 I/O. So balancing out that for a virtual machine story, you need not just I/O but capacity, because we're talking about now storing 22 sets of virtual machines. Each of those sets totaled, I think, 15 gigabytes last time.
Okay.
No, it was more than that. Anyway, if anybody's curious about the storage, I can talk about that separately. But we were definitely I/O constrained, not storage capacity constrained. But we had not enough capacity to run purely on SSD, and that's still not going to be a realistic scenario. So ultimately, we're going to use Hyper-V with storage spaces to alleviate that storage problem. And again, going to multiple 10 gig networking rather than even the 8 1 gig networks. Sorry, 8 1 gig connections back to our blades was I believe running at 40% for the storage I/O. So again, yeah, traditionally to use storage channel. So I'm not actually done yet. I'm missing a slide in here. But going back to the reason why we want to be going to going to storage spaces is during the last event, this machine was running VMware ESXi. These machines were already VMware ESXi, but this machine also had Falcon Store on it. And Falcon Store is basically a iSCSI distributed SAN OS. So you basically take a pair of them, give each of them a matching set of disks, and you get a network RAID 1 type storage. Falcon Store worked amazingly well for us. The storage that's going from these blades to this storage was wholly facilitated by that. We looked at also utilizing Falcon Store in a set of 5 instead of a set of 2, whereby we'd install one set on each of the hypervisors themselves. They all have local disks, and those local disks were not being utilized at all by the actual virtual machine process. Anyway, we investigated using Falcon Store, but for all 5 of those, but ultimately found that the 10 disks that we have in there are meaningless compared to the performance the Delve server was giving us for storage with the SSD channel. So ultimately, yeah, storage will be henceforth using Microsoft Stack. Do you have anything else you want to cover? Anybody any questions on any of this?
Did you take any throttling steps to prevent one team from posing the connection to the others?
Sure, I'll take that. So the question was, did we take any steps to prevent, I think was this right, Travis, to prevent one team from mucking with another team?
Basically.
Okay, absolutely, yes. So on the router side, this was a big concern, again, because we had the BYOD. We don't know, it's a huge unknown. What are these students going to bring in? So we don't really want them to affect each other, right? And while there are rules around, general conduct, like don't screw with your opponents, I think was one of the rules. We did enforce that. Actually, we logged heavily. Again, we logged all the traffic out of the game site, but we also logged any ACL violations on the routers. So if we saw packets that were actually, if Team A was scanning Team B's targets, for example, or they were trying to mess with each other's laptops or whatever, that was all logged as an exception. We were really, really careful about that. Not only were we careful about stuff not leaking out the network, we want to make sure that everybody's sort of playing fair and not messing with each other. So yeah, that was a big consideration. Oh yeah, look, slides. So essentially, we have these 2 green routers here. Every interface on those routers had very strict ACLs about who could talk to who. It worked great. Looking back at the logs, we actually didn't have any students messing with each other. Frankly, they had enough to do. They had enough on their plates that they weren't messing with each other. But that was important. We needed to be able to guarantee that one team couldn't say, oh man, I lost because those jerks over there, were messing with my VMs. So we had very strict separation. Any other questions?
I'll take that as a no.
I'll take that as a no. Okay, thanks everyone.